The Livella, Part 5, A Hierophant's Legacy. Weld and Naro at the depository, after repairing their crystal power array that had been sabotaged by Ruzavir the Underlord, have just learned to their surprise that a priestess of the Void is coming to name their newborn baby forest brother, contrary to the usual tradition of pilgrimages of naming. We now rejoin the story with Priestess Omnia. It was hard for Priestess Omnia to decide which of the heavy prices she was having to pay for her venture into the morass had cost her the most. Although she now finally had the opportunity to process and grieve the apparently senseless loss of her beloved betrothed, Terric, she was finding it impossible to do so because of the tremendous upheaval of returning to a world which, from her perspective, had advanced in time some 2.5 centuries in the space of mere days. Itlancourt itself had changed surprisingly little, the citadel and the polyastry even less. The capital's shimmering, wide avenues, with their familiar, immaculately barbered rose bushes, sculptures and fountains studded along a platformed central aisle, had altered ever so slightly in hue since her time. Omnia fancied that they must have upgraded a goodly proportion of the tiny copper shavings embedded in the glossy laminated road surfaces to orichalcum, presumably facilitating a smoother ride on the floating personal carriages and public hovertrams the citizenry utilized to get around, as well as providing a more efficient overall transmission of etheric force. Omnia herself hailed from a prestigious family of resonance crystal quarriers and so had grown up around folk who had good knowledge of and access to some of the more sophisticated manifestations of Itlan technology. The aesthetic style of the trams and carriages that glided at an unhurried pace along these avenues had also changed slightly. They had grown somewhat less angular, more flared and curvy at the edges in a manner that Omnia actually found pleasing to the eye and served to reassure her that in spite of her shocking and unexpected displacement in time, Itlan civilization had lost none of its sense of whimsy or creative elegance. The buildings hadn't changed at all, save that one or two of the more prominent ones had grown slightly taller or altered a facade here and there. Itlan architecture was designed and built to defy the centuries, and now Omnia could see for herself that this was no idle conceit. However, while the young priestess was in no small way reassured by the sense of permanence and majesty Itlancourt's sublime beauty offered in every balustrade and lovingly tended communal garden, it nevertheless lacked the power to entirely assuage her deep sorrow or the profound culture shock of having been catapulted some 10 generations into her future. Hierophant Mallie had been quite correct. Omnia had not been able to find any immediate trace of her friends or social group. She had not yet entirely given up hope, however. The Hierophant herself, and most of her colleagues who shared that rank, were proof that some of the most accomplished mystics of Itlan society were in fact capable of living far longer than ordinary folk. Some of her old friends had been promising young priests and priestesses like herself it wasn't inconceivable that maybe one or two of them had survived this long and might be around somewhere, although it seemed highly unlikely that any more than a very small number of them, and almost certainly none of her own family, would have been able to achieve such longevity. I really wouldn't recommend telling anyone you've been lost in the morass for 250 years, the young priestess recalled Mallie having advised her in a low voice as they had exited the catacombs and returned to the sunlit corridors of the polyastry. Especially other hierophants. If you care about your future here at the polyastry, that is. My colleagues would not approve of what you have done, even if any of them from your time who knew you are still around. I will arrange you a new chamber here before this day is out, and tell the High Priest that you are a recently ordained acolyte from one of the peripherals, one of their brightest and best come to serve here in Itlancourt. That will adequately explain your slightly outmoded speech and raiment to all but the most discerning of them. You should keep a low profile, sanctified daughter, at least until you have returned from your pilgrimage. And if any other Hierophant bothers you with questions, I want you to let me know about it immediately. Is that clear? Of course, merchants, Omnia had promised earnestly, still unable to think beyond the relief and elation she had felt at seeing sunlight and the familiar, smoothly polished, mottled granite walls of the polyastry once more. And when will your merchants instruct me on the details of my pilgrimage? I will seek you out in a couple of days to brief you on your pilgrimage, the Hierophant had told her. In the meantime, I have some other urgent matters that need my attention. Until then, I bid you not to stray from the confines of the first dactyle. I'll be vexed if I have to come looking for you. Mallie held up a stern finger in warning, then waved the young priestess off with a twitch of her wrist. Now rest, meditate, go to meet your new colleagues. You are dismissed, sanctified daughter. And so, Omnia had moped the last 2 days away among the immaculate courtyards and sumptuous flower gardens of the citadel, obediently remaining within Itlancourt's first dactyle, the innermost concentric canal that surrounded it, and, heeding Mallie's warning, resisting the urge to ask around just yet for evidence that any of her former friends or colleagues might still be around. Her newly assigned chamber, of course, contained none of her now long-lost personal belongings, and so was, as of yet, a miserable and lonely place to spend any time in. In order that the clothes she had spent her entire time in the Moraz could finally be washed, she had had to borrow an old and ill-fitting priestess's raiment from the rather quizzical high priest Estilar, who had placidly accepted her story of having lost all her luggage in a freak sea storm on her way from the peripherals to the capital, but not without a slightly sardonic raised eyebrow and an amused twist of his lips. Theirs was a denomination that did not, after all, believe in showing any particular favour towards truth over falsehood, both of them being children of the void. It was in the midst of a long morning in which Omnia was lamenting deeply about the strange and apparently random demise of her beloved, and racking her brains for anything she might have learned about the phenomenon of corrupted resonance crystals from her family and background, when Hierophant Mallie finally caught up with her again. She was sat, as she had been for much of these last 2 days, in one of the many pretty, vine-clad gazebos dotted around the gardens of the polyastry, caught in the rays of the morning sun, with her eyes closed and her inner gaze contemplating the desolation of her heart. A shadow fell across her, bringing her awareness back to the chill of the sudden shade. Omnia opened her eyes to find the Hierophant silhouetted in front of her, iconic lace headdress perfectly eclipsing the spring sunshine. "Sanctified daughter Omnia," the silhouette's voice greeted her formally. The priestess inclined her head deeply. "Merchants Mallie," she felt almost relieved to finally be distracted from her gloomy reverie. "You are charged to embark on a pilgrimage of naming." Omnia's pretty face crinkled in a slight frown of puzzlement. Although pilgrimages of naming, in which a newborn forest child was formally recognized into Itlan society, were considered to be events of notable spiritual significance, they were not especially uncommon. They happened at least once a year, perhaps sometimes more. What was highly unusual was that she, as a priestess of the void, was being selected for this type of pilgrimage, instead of a priestess from one of the more traditional denominations for such things, like the Itan or the Zeno. Noticing the young woman's expression, Mallie moved out of the path of sunlight, allowing the warmth to return to the young priestess's face, and sat down next to her. "I know what you're thinking," said the Hierophant conversationally. "You're wondering why the break of tradition. Why on Itan is a priestess of nothing being asked to go on a naming pilgrimage?" "Yes, Merchant, it is as you say. I am curious." "The appropriate answer, for servants of the void such as we, is, of course, there is no reason," Mallie responded dryly. "But I believe you deserve a better answer than that, given your particular circumstances and bereavement." The truth of the matter is, I happened to find out about this new forest child that you are charged to name before the other Hierophants did." The young priestess shrugged her slender shoulders silently, still none the wiser. "It is unclear when the last time was that a priestess of the void last named a forest child, if ever, indeed, it has happened at all. Surely there is wisdom in such tradition, Merchants." "Traditions are powerful," the Hierophant agreed softly, "but they were once nothing more than changes in behavior. Who understands such things more than the likes of us, sanctified daughter? That which is not begets that which is," Omnia finished the popular doxology of their denomination automatically. "Indeed. And so, sanctified daughter, at the Council of Hierophants, I have invoked divine emergence to act as I see fit, as is my right as a Hierophant of the Void." Omnia gasped in utter astonishment at this. "You evoke divine emergence for something so trivial?" she blurted. Then she stiffened and clapped her hand over her mouth, mortified. "Forgive me, Merchants. I spoke out of turn and out of place. I meant no disrespect." Mallie raised an eyebrow, though she remained calm. "Trivial? Yes. I suppose many outside of our denomination would think so. It is, after all, a holy invocation a Hierophant is only permitted to make once in a lifetime, intended to be the definition of their legacy. But are we not so often delightfully derided as worshippers of nothing?" She then quoted another popular doxology. "Nothing is sacred and nothing is profane." She shrugged and spread her palms wide. "I do as I am minded to do. The time has come for me to define my legacy as a Hierophant, and I choose this break in tradition." "Whatever you say, Merchants," Omnia agreed, her demeanor now a picture of contrition. She shook her head in amazement then, all of her depression and melancholy temporarily dismissed from her conscious awareness. "You do me great honor, Merchants, sending me on a pilgrimage of such portentous moment." Mallie smiled a little coldly. "Your tragic romantic misfortune and your experience in the morass make you uniquely qualified, sanctified daughter. Just make sure you don't screw it up." Priestess Omnia flinched slightly. "No, Merchants." The Hierophant stood up to leave. "The baby is to be named Thesopher," she announced in a voice that brooked no argument, leaving Omnia sitting there, even more shocked than before. As far as Omnia had been aware, it was traditional for the priestess undergoing the pilgrimage to name the baby. This was a fundamental spiritual facet of such a trip, as it bonded the one undertaking the pilgrimage with the infant through a profound responsibility of providing a given name sanctified by the polyastry of Itlancourt. A naming was, in a very real sense, a species of lifelong blessing. Normally, Omnia might have even dared to respectfully protest the Hierophant's proclamation, but she found herself far too intimidated by the fact that Mallie, having evoked divine emergence in this matter, and thereby already having overruled tradition in doing so, had imposed her own personal legacy on this situation so profoundly that Omnia lacked the personal self-confidence to challenge her. Mallie, sensing Omnia's sudden and considerable discomfort, did not give the priestess the chance to act upon it. Turning on her booted heel, the Hierophant strode away, her black and white lace headdress bobbing rhythmically behind her like a self-satisfied nod of affirmation as she left. Itlancourt's public hovertrams could be embarked upon from 8 public stations situated at and precisely between the 4 cardinal directions at the outer rim of the citadel that was the hub of the capital itself. Radiating outward from each of these stations were Itlancourt's 8 cardinal boulevards, each of which bridged all 10 dactyls and traversed the entire radius of the city to its very outer edge. Omnia sat, snugly dressed up in sturdy but still fetching travel clothes gifted to her by the polyastry, perched daintily on one of the sheltered seats provided by the hovertram station that connected the edge of the citadel with Itlancourt's harbour district. At the corresponding end station waited the seacraft that would bear her to the island of Dis, upon which was situated the depository where the baby, whom she had been charged to name, lived. Omnia, however, could not think about this trip without fuming in frustration. She had accepted this pilgrimage entirely innocently and in good faith, having believed it a fair, even pleasant price to pay for having been rescued from the Moraz, but she now couldn't help but feel she had been cleverly manipulated by Mallie, who had cunningly steered her into agreeing to undertake a highly unorthodox pilgrimage that furthered whatever agenda the Hierophant had concocted to advance her legacy, potentially at the expense of the young priestess's own career, reputation, and, who knew, perhaps even spiritual well-being. Ever since Mallie had told her what to name the infant yesterday in the gardens of the polyastry, Omnia had been racking her brains trying to think of some way out, but there simply didn't seem to be any. She felt every bit as lost, as if she was still wandering aimlessly through the corridors of the Moraz. She had no friends to confide in, no family to retreat to. Now, with bitter rue, she realized what a gift she must have seemed to Mallie, lost and alone, heartbroken and completely disconnected from the life she had built for herself, now 2.5 centuries past. As the young priestess sat there, stewing in her resentment at being so used at this difficult time, as she waited for her hovertram to arrive, that familiar scent of lavender mixed with ground vunquam beans lightly announced its presence. A scent Omnia now associated with the inner anger she was keeping clenched inside. "You are not pleased with me," said Mallie as she sat down next to the young priestess. "I can understand that, sanctified daughter." Omnia sensed, rather than saw, the others who had been waiting for the hovertram melt out of the way as soon as they saw Mallie's Hierophant headdress. "Well, nobody likes to learn they've been manipulated and sold short, merchants," Omnia replied through clenched teeth. "Then I bid you be more like nobody." Mallie could not quite disguise the sneer in her voice. "Remember the denomination to which you have dedicated your life, sanctified daughter. Your indignant aura offends me just as much as my machination offends you. A pilgrimage is supposed to be a trial, or were you expecting a merry little holiday with no challenges, perhaps? You would have been more than happy to sell me short had such been the case, I suspect. Everything is worth the price we agree to pay." Omnia sighed. "What is the meaning of all this, merchants? Why are you prepared to stake your legacy, and my very soul perhaps, on this pilgrimage? I believe I have a right to know." "Oh, it's just a name," the Hierophant drawled irritably. "What do we worshippers of the void say in our prayers, sanctified daughter? Nothing is sacred and nothing is profane. Isn't this the point? I am staking my legacy on the premise that these traditions around the naming of forest children have become excessively sacred and somber. Satisfied?" She guffawed madly. "I had given some serious consideration to naming the babe Butthead. Would you have preferred that, sanctified daughter?" "Why are you here, merchants?" Omnia asked bluntly, reasoning that she could afford now to express some displeasure and disrespect, seeing as how the Hierophant clearly had need of her. "I have one extra task for you while you are away on your travels," Mallie shrugged blandly. "I agreed to no further charge, merchants." "Oh, this has nothing to do with your pilgrimage," Mallie assured her blandly, putting an almost but not quite undetectable inflection on the word nothing, as clerics of their particular denomination were wont to do. She held out a nondescript leather bag that Omnia immediately recognized to be one that was typically used to carry around resonance crystals. "There is a colleague of mine on the island of Dis who recently did me a favor. I would like you to give him this as my payment for this favor. His name is Roosevere. He will be waiting for you at the harbor when you arrive." End of part 5. Why has Mallie broken tradition and chosen Omnia to go on this pilgrimage of naming? What is our young priestess delivering to Ruzavir the Underlord, and how does all this help them in their dastardly plan to abduct the baby forest brother for his fairy blood? And what's in store for the other forest brothers at the depository? Stay tuned to find out.
Hi to all my listeners. A big thank you for tuning into this latest instalment of the Livella. Don't forget, if you do feel inclined to tip me for my work, you can do so via the link in the description. Cheers.